Hello class, so now we're looking at chapter 7. Again, this is Introduction to Physical and Cognitive Development in Early Childhood. So this is 24 months to 6 or 7 years of age in that direction. And they break the chapter up into two components, physical and cognitive. Sometimes the chapters will do that, they'll put them together, sometimes they'll break them apart. One thing that I want to emphasize that I usually do in the class is some of the physical changes. And the one that stands out the most is the proximal distal pattern of growth. So if you look at a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old and you compare them to each other, one thing that you're going to notice is that a 2-year-old has got little short, stubby arms and legs in proportion to their trunk. And what's so interesting is that as they mature, you'll see that this kind of becomes more balanced in proportion with each other. And again, that's an example of that proximal distal pattern of growth that we talked about back in chapter 4. I'm looking at my notes here, seeing what other things that I want to mention. Brain, one of the big things we see in the brain is not so much brain size increasing, but we see dramatic changes within the brain, the components of the brain. And that's an example of this blooming and pruning process where all these neuron connections are developed together, and if we don't use it, then it's pruned. And this is an example of what they call myelination. So you'll see this myelination occurring in a rapid kind of spurts of growth during this stage. And consequently, in this particular chapter, we're going to look at cognitive development. We're going to be looking at 3 different approaches too. Come to that in just a minute here. Sleep, they talk about sleep, 11 to 13 hours is needed. One thing that's kind of interesting is for children that do not want to go to sleep, they're really resistant to it. Some research will show that there's a correlation between those kids who are resistant to going to sleep, fighting about going to sleep, and conduct disorders later on. It can also be linked with depression and anxiety later on as well. Nutrition is a big issue that's discussed in the class. One big concern is obesity, childhood obesity, and it is so tragic. Mostly it's a result of our diet, our fast food diet. For the first time, I've seen kids in my practice, 10, 11 years of age, who've had strokes. I would have never seen that 10 years ago. But now, occasionally, it'll come across, and it just amazes me. But it's associated with that, with our poor diet. Accidents for this age, the motor vehicle accidents are the leading cause of death. It can be as a pedestrian or certainly as a passenger that we see this. The second one is followed by cancer. And typically when we look at cancer at this young of an age, you're going to see them as blood-borne type cancers, leukemia as an example of it. What is interesting, cancer is horrific no matter what age you have. These guys seem to be more resilient. With the example of leukemia, if you're diagnosed with leukemia as an adult, you have 2/3 chance of dying. If you're diagnosed with leukemia as a child, you have 2/3 chance of surviving. And so it's kind of like the inverse we see with these little guys, followed by cardiovascular disease, the strokes I was telling you about. HIV/AIDS is another concern with children. And then the last thing to talk about is more in developing countries, is dehydration. And dehydration due to drinking contaminated water that causes them to have diarrhea and vomiting. Some cognitive changes. Let me go over there real quick. Again, we started with Piaget's approach. It's an introduction to operations. So this is Piaget's pre-operational stage of development, from 2 to 7. Pre-operation, or operation, is defined as a reversible mental action. So for example, say imagine this is a clay. If I stretch, say I have two things of clay, they're equal in size. If I stretch, this is A and this is B. If I stretch B out, excuse me, to be a long snake, and I asked you, is A still equal to B? You'll say yes. That's because in your mind you can reverse that snake back to the original ball of clay, where A was equal to B here. These guys aren't able to do that. They're not able to do things. They're not able to do these reversible actions. That's why Piaget calls it pre-operational stage of development. There is broken up a symbolic function substage. This is from 2 to 4 years of age. That's where they mentally represent an object that's not present. So they'll draw pictures of their mom or their dad, and you think, that is not me, but to them it is. And then there is the symbolic thought substage. Where are we at here? Excuse me, I just talked about that. They have two limitations in the symbolic thought substage. Egocentrism, that's the inability to distinguish one's own perspective from someone else, and the three mountain task is the best example of that. And what that is, that's where the child sits at one end, there's three mountains, and there's like an object, there's a water tower, and then there's a cross on another mountain. And they ask the child, we put a teddy bear over here, and they're sitting there, they'll ask the child, what's the teddy bear right here seeing? And they'll say that they're seeing the same thing that they're seeing. So that's one of those limitations of egocentrism. And then there is animism, and that's a belief that inanimate objects have lifelike abilities. There's the intuitive thought substage, which is from 4 to 7, and that's where they just have they have solutions to problems, but not much thought given to it. So it's more of an intuitive answer. In this stage, the intuitive thought substage from 4 to 7, two limitations are centration and conservation. So centration is where they're focusing on one characteristic to the exclusion of all else. So they're just focusing on one thing and they're not taking anything else in the environment. And then conservation is the famous 3-beaker experiment. And so if you can imagine, we've got 2 beakers and they're the same type of shape here, A and B, and I pour colored Kool-Aid in A and B and they're equal. And then I have another beaker that's really long and thin. If I pour the fluid from B into C, the long beaker, the children are going to say that one is greater than the other. And that is a limitation of conservation. They also introduced us to Vygotsky. Vygotsky was an interesting guy. He died at a young age of 37 of tuberculosis. He had kind of a recurring tuberculosis thing that was going on with him. Brilliant man, multilingual, and his approach was a social constructivist approach. So it distinguished it from Piaget. Piaget had a cognitive approach, and his was social constructivist approach. So what Vygotsky would say is that we don't really learn in a vacuum. And Piaget would say, yeah, that's okay. That we can learn in a vacuum, that it's not about that social interaction. For Vygotsky, it was a huge thing. Two components of Vygotsky's theory that was really important was language and thought. And so if you ever find yourself talking to yourself to try to figure out a problem, and then you come to that solution, that's where language and thought comes together to solve a problem. That's like a field goal for Vygotsky. He also has these zones of proximal development, and these are zones based off of age and tasks that they can do as they gain skills. And then there's the information processing. That's the third theory that they talk about here. And information processing theory is essentially looking at attention and focusing on cognitive resources. Planning is a big component of it. They talk about 2 deficits of preschool children. Is salient versus relevant, stimuli that stand out versus what's important. They have some difficulties distinguishing that. Then after age 6 or 7, they're able to grasp that contact. understanding, and then planfulness. They have a tendency to use haphazard approaches to solving problems at a younger age, and then at the end, they seem to grasp it well. So those are the major components of the chapter, guys, that I wanted to talk about. There is one last thing I do want to mention, and that is, I talk about it in class, is Frederick Froebels. He's the one who started kindergarten, kind of like was the beginning of Montessori approach. The text doesn't really address him very much, but I certainly bring it up in class. It was in 1840 where he's the guy who coined the word kindergarten. So with that said, guys, that's at least a little bit of an introduction into Chapter 7. Thank you very much, guys, for your hard work.